This is where a HOA son calls 911 on me for a smart lock at my ranch paw, and it just keeps getting better as the story goes on. It's gonna make you smile, I promise. It was a beautiful day here in Texas. The sun was shining. We had just finished up some horse chores. Got to love this part of the day. That's when your horses are done. You can still see them back there grazing right now. They just got done with their afternoon pasture time, and we were just sitting out by the pool trying to cool off and relax. And I was working on my laptop, doing some work, some emails, some paperwork for my ranch, when all of a sudden, bam, I hear sirens. I look up. I don't see any lights or anything like that. So I sit there, and about 2 minutes later, they go, bam, bam. And I think, geez, that's kinda close. Wonder what that was? Maybe an ambulance? Maybe a fire truck? Who knows? Don't really pay attention to it. Go back to work. About 3 or 4 minutes later, they come again. Bam, bam. And they're getting closer. So I look up, and I see a police car coming down my driveway. And I think, well, that's not good. What did I do? The only thing I could think of is I was working on my laptop, and I was going, I wonder if they going to put a signal jammer on there. So I unuse my cameras while I am in the shower, and then I thought, wait a minute, my smart Wi-Fi lock. I have one of those Wi-Fi locks on my front door, and I thought maybe somebody reported that, but I knew that was ridiculous, because first of all, you can't get into my property unless you have a code. Secondly, even if you did get into my property, you would have to be within 30 feet of the door to actually open it. And third of all, they could unpossibly know my IP address and what my camera system is, and know to come out here and check that. So I didn't worry about it too much. And then as the cop came down the driveway, he stops right here at the gate, and he gets out and starts knocking on the gate and hollered in there. And I go, yes, sir. He says, is this your vehicle? And I said, yes. He said, do you live here? And I said, yes, sir. He asked me for my driver's license and registration, and I went and got my wallet. When I went and got my wallet, I grabbed my phone and I pulled up my Ring app and I hit record. When I came back, I gave him my license and everything, and I said, hey man, I noticed you're recording. And I said, yeah. And he said, well, why are you recording? And I said, well, you know I have a right to record you if I want to. And he said, well, that's fine, as long as you're not interfering with the investigation, which you're not. And I said, okay, no problem. So he told me that his dispatch sent him out here to check on a possible trespasser and breaking into vehicles. And I said, oh, okay. And he asked me if anybody had been over there by my barn area. And I said, no, nobody's been over there since yesterday morning. He then started walking around the property, looking around, checking everything out, and he talked to me a few minutes about just neighborhood watch things, and then he finally left. And I'm thinking to myself, man, what a waste of time. But you know, whatever. Not a big deal. I'll move on. But then, about 10 minutes later, the same cop shows up again, and this time he's with another cop, and they both come walking up to me. And he says, have you called the cops on somebody? And I said, no. Why would I call the cops on somebody? He says, well, somebody called and said that you almost ran them over with your truck, and that you were trespassing. And I said, are you kidding me? That's ridiculous. And the other cop started laughing, and I said, what's so funny about that? He said, don't worry about it. It's your neighbor. He probably did it to get back at you for something. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I guess he doesn't like you. I said, well, why wouldn't I like him? He runs his mouth constantly about everything I do here on my property. And I said, yeah, that's why I have a no trespass sign on my gate. And that's why I have this big old fence. So I don't have to deal with him. Well, What happens next is crazy. The officer then tells me that they need to ask me some questions about my security cameras. And I said, sure. And they asked me, what kind of cameras do I have? What do I have for internet service providers? Who's my internet service provider? And I gave them that information. And then they asked me, do I mind if they check my cameras? And I said, well, they're public. I said, what do you mean, public? He says, well, they're on my property. I said, yeah, but you can see through my windows. You can see through my blinds. Anybody can see in my house. These cameras are public. They're on my property. I can't imagine why you need to see my security cameras, but if you want to look at my security cameras, go ahead. So they went and sat by my pool. They plugged in one of their laptops. They checked my Ring cameras. They checked my Arlo cameras. They checked all my cameras that are around my property. They went everywhere. They looked in every barn. And they did it all with a smile on their face, making conversation with me. They were great guys. And after they left, I was thinking to myself, geez, that's a waste of time. But I was glad that they checked out my property. Finally, they found nothing and they left. Now, what happened was that I have a security camera right here. That's a spotlight camera, and I had it pointed towards the driveway. And apparently his wife was driving home from work. She saw the light from my spotlight camera, because sometimes it shines into her backyard. So she asked her husband, who's out there? Because she said she saw a spotlight shine right in her window, and he looked and he saw the cameras. And so he decided, you know what, let's call the cops and see what's going on. And he said, yeah, you almost ran us over. And he said, no, we didn't run you over. And then they started arguing, and she said, well, you're always causing problems with these people. And he said, no, I'm not. And she said, well, I'm calling the cops. And he said, go ahead. The funny thing is when the cops show up, he never corrected her and told her that he was the one that made the phone call. He actually put all the blame on me. And that's what the officer was telling me. He said, your neighbor is a real piece of work. He's always causing trouble with him. I think he just wants to get you in trouble. I think he's just jealous of your nice place and your nice stuff. And he said, you were lucky you weren't outside when he called, because he might have said that you attacked him or something like that. And I said, well, who knows? The officer then said, listen, you need to keep an eye on your place. If you see anything else strange, give us a call. We'll take care of it. And sure enough, 2 days later, I am sitting by the pool and I notice that the spotlight camera is shining in his backyard again. And I'm thinking to myself, I wonder if they're coming back. 2 minutes later, I hear the sirens and I see the lights. And I thought, geez, that's fast. I don't think it took them but about 5 minutes to get here. So once again, the same thing happened. They showed up. They investigated. They said, yep, your neighbor's at it again. He called and said that you're shining a spotlight in his house. He wants to press charges for harassment. I said, really? And they said, yeah, really. And I said, well, tell him that I apologize if my spotlight shines in his house. Tell him that I'll try to angle it away from his house. But I said, how in the world can I angle it away from his house? It's right over there. I can't angle it any more than I already have. And the officer said, yeah, you should be able to. And I said, no, I can't. It's physically impossible to do. And then I said, tell him that I will allow him to come over here and put a shield up if he est that bothered by it. And they said, well, okay, we'll tell him that. And then we talked a little bit more. They stayed out here quite a while. We talked about everything. They left, and everything was fine. And about an hour later, I heard sirens again. I look up and I see them coming, and I thought, man, I hope they didn't forget something. I hope they didn't miss something. So I'm waiting there, and they pull up, and they start backing up the cop car, and they hold on, hold on, and they're going back and forth and talking to each other, and I thought, wow, I wonder what's going on. Was there something else they missed? What else could they have missed? Well, turns out what happened was they backed up to look at the tires on their car, and they realized they had forgotten their tire tread, and they needed to get a print from my driveway, because they were going to compare it to his truck, and so that's why they came back. I thought that was pretty funny. Anyways, I'm curious to know what you would have done in this situation. Let me know. And also, if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. We'd really appreciate it. Thank you so much. See you later.